Ben, thank you very much for being on the podcast.
My pleasure.
So today we're obviously going to be talking about North Korea, and what we want to cover is a brief history, economy, government, and some other interesting subjects. But before we get into that, let me try to list the titles that you have or positions that you hold. Let me see if I got it right. So
No, no pressure to list all of them. It's not.
just a few.
Whatever you find important. All right. Yeah.
Associate Scholar at Foreign Policy Research Institute, non-resident fellow at Stimson Center, and editor of North Korean Economy Watch. Is it fair?
Yeah.
And that website, by the way, I did not realize there is such a resource where you can find so much information about the country. I was fascinated by that. Thank you.
I'm glad you find it useful. I should also add I'm finishing my PhD dissertation at the University of Pennsylvania as well. So that's sort of my main job.
What's a thesis?
On the history of surveillance in North Korea. So it's based on interviews with North Korean defectors last year in South Korea. So
gotcha. So it's fascinating. Yeah. So you're a citizen of Sweden. You live in Israel. You
citizen
study
of Sweden and Israel, but yeah.
Okay. You study PhD. I mean, you're pursuing your PhD at University of Pennsylvania in the United States, and you're interested in North Korea. Can you reconcile all this?
Yeah. I'm not sure it's possible to reconcile all of it, but no, I was born in Sweden. I grew up there for the most part of my life, and then America is a very good place for academia in general. I think just within the field that I'm in, at least, it's very hard to beat. So it was a natural place for me to try to go to for graduate school, and then it's also a lovely country in a lot of ways. And then Israel is where I live permanently, and then I also spent a lot of time, obviously, in South Korea because I mean, there's really no other place to go to for research. North Korea, unfortunately, is closed for most academics. You can't go there and look around and interview people or look for materials in archives. It's completely shut to any kind of research like that. Unfortunately, one day, hopefully.
Why are you interested in the country? Is it because there are very few people who are doing research on it, or you have personal reasons?
So I don't have any clear personal reasons. I mean, given that I'm Jewish, I've always been very interested in I mean, the history of Nazi Germany is something I started reading about when I was very young, and then I got interested in dictatorships in general, just what makes them tick, how they function, if they're sustainable or not, which I think is debatable. And then I don't know, North Korea just seemed it was the one place that I couldn't find enough materials on when I wanted to read about it, and that got me very intrigued because then. If there's so little written, if there's so many things that we just don't know, well, I don't know, it just made me so much more curious, and it made me want to figure out all these things that there was no way for me to find out through books. So I guess I'm trying to answer the questions that I've had from a very young age about North Korea, and I'm not sure I'm succeeding, but I'm trying.
Let's talk about the country, because I know about North Korea as much as the next guy. So let's go back to the history. It's a fairly new country, right?
Yeah. So I'm going to try to not give you the full timeline of Korean history, but I just wanted there are two. It easily happens with academics, I think, but there are two aspects of Korean history that I think are important to know about to understand North Korean history. One is that Korea has been a country was a kingdom for quite a long time. You have two main dynasties that the first one stretched from the year 935 till 1392, and then the Chosun dynasty from 1392 to 1910. The point is that Korea was a country for quite a long time with a great deal of influence from China, but still fairly cut off in a lot of ways from the outside world. That's at least sort of the nationalist narrative of Korean history. And it's important to remember for just understanding that Korea is its own culture in a way, of course influenced by others, but still with its own history. The second period to sort of be aware of is the Japanese occupation or colonial period from 1910 till 1945. It had a very strong legacy in the way that both governments in North Korea and South Korea, for that matter, are organized. Like a lot of institutions are inheritances from the Japanese colonial era, and this is something that I don't think people emphasize enough in the study of the history of North Korea and South Korea. It's also, a very painful memory, exploited, quite a great deal by both governments, both in North and South Korea. So it's also something to be aware of. And then to finally get to actual North Korea, in 1945, Japan lost the war against America and the Soviet Union, and it also lost its colony in Korea. So Korea was divided into two zones of occupation. In the south, the United States was the occupying force, and in the north, the Soviet Union. So that's really where the current situation starts, in a way, that division that happened under the auspices of foreign powers, which is quite important to remember. So that is the most recent simple explanation for why North Korea looks the way it does today.
I believe Soviets, they appointed Kim Il-sung as a...
Yes, exactly.
And
yeah, he was basically handpicked by the Soviet Union. He spoke Russian fairly well.
How did this man convince everyone that he's almost a semi-god? Is it fair assessment?
Yeah, I mean, the question is, did he convince people of that, or did other people who wanted to suck up to him convince people of that? I think it's a question for me that's very interesting, because in systems like the North Korean one, yes, you have the brutal dictator on top who controls most aspects of the country, but you also have a lot of people underneath him who have an interest in being in his good graces, so to speak. So I think that it was really common. Like, I just have a very hard time imagining any leader saying, oh, you should call me the son of humanity and treat me like the god of the world, basically. So I think it's a combination of, North Koreans love to use the term flunkyism, as basically it means like sucking up to foreign powers. But I think you have the same phenomenon in North Korea as well, where people suck up to the leader. And that is probably part of the reason why the cult of personality arose. But at the same time, you should also remember Korea had just come out of a long period of being under the Japanese Empire, with an emperor that in a lot of ways symbolically looked very similar, and like the system, like the cult of the emperor is quite similar to what we see around the leaders today in North Korea. So that's also, it might have seemed natural at the time to create that kind of culture.
So today, how's this government organized? Can you kind of walk me through the org chart for the
Sure. So I'm actually gonna partially skip over the org chart of it, because I think the most important thing to know is, yes, you have an organizational chart of how the country's run. The thing is, formal institutions don't necessarily matter very much in North Korea, or at least, the division of responsibility and things like that. Like, it matters on the nitty-gritty level, but because it is so centered around one family and around Kim Jong-un today, it's really like he doesn't really have, there's no curtailment of the power of the one-man ruler today in North Korea. So yes, you have the Supreme People's Assembly, the North Korean Parliament. Their job is mainly ceremonial, like they meet every now and then. I believe it's usually around once a year, and pass certain bills and certain proposals. There's no debate. There are no independent proposals for policy. There's no discussion at all. It's mainly it's like a ceremony to grant legitimacy to the state. So in a sense, there is really no set hierarchy, because you have only one person at the top. I mean, it's very much like, I wouldn't say that Stalinist Soviet Union was a hierarchical system, because everything evolved around the leader, and whatever the leader said, that's what you went with. That's not to say that the sort of ruling coalition, or whatever you want to call it, doesn't matter. You have to keep a lot of people happy when you're a dictator, because you have to keep the military bureaucracy and the security bureaucracy and the civilians to some extent as well. You have to keep them happy to an extent. But at the end of the day, this formal hierarchy of governance in North Korea tells you very little about how it's actually run. Can I keep going, or because I can talk forever about this? But
please,
because I want to mention that. Good. So again, there is a legislature, but all members, and there are some small political parties that they're historical remnants of political parties and movements that used to exist in North Korea, but they're all members of a formal ruling coalition, the United Front for Political Parties, which is run and controlled by the Korean Workers' Party. So it is a one-party state. and a system where with a one person rule. There is a court system, of course, but it's also there's a lot we don't know about how it works. But it's also, if whatever the Workers' Party says, like it's no prosecutor, no lawyer is going to go up against that and make their convincing case in court and win against the government. That doesn't happen. And the rule of law doesn't really function in the same way. I mean, it doesn't exist. It's not ruled by law, it's ruled by decree or ruled by the party. There is one question mark about all this to my mind, because we've seen the North Korean economy develop quite a bit in the past few years with more room for market mechanisms and private enterprise. So I wonder what the role of the judiciary is in all this. Like if there is any sense of, if you can take your business partner to court for not doing what the contract says. I should also mention that, I keep repeating that, we don't know X, Y, Z. It's because North Korea is a very, very closed society. There are very basic facts about the country that we just don't know. And because they're considered state secrets. Try to get a, phone book for North Korea. I've seen one time in a library in South Korea, but it's all, these things are classified essentially. Like it's illegal to bring it out of the country because it's considered a matter of national security.
Wow, that's fascinating. And you touched base on the economy. I'm curious how the economy functions and what are the main sectors of the economy.
Yeah, so this is another one of those areas where we can make qualified guesses, and that's part of what I try to do on NorthKoreanEconomyWatch.com website. But again, like any figures I give you are going to be guesstimates, but I'm going to give you some of them because I think they're useful benchmarks at least. So we have South Korean institution, the South Korean Central Bank, Bank of Korea. They make estimates every year of North Korea's, like the proportions of what sectors contribute what percentage to GDP essentially. And they put agriculture at 20%, the mining industry at 34.5%, services at 30%. And yeah, like this makes sense because agriculture is a crucial sector in North Korea, and North Korea strives to be self-sufficient in food production. They aren't entirely, but that's another issue. The mining industry is extremely important. North Korea is a very, very mountainous country, and especially in the northern regions of the country, you have a lot of coal, steel manufacturing, like a lot of heavy industry. The 30% services sector, I really don't know how, like what services means in this context, because for one, we don't know exactly what is private and what is state owned in North Korea. When you say services, are you talking also about, I presume that would encapsulate things like, the market economy as a whole, which is very, very significant in North Korea. It is ostensibly a communist country, but you have a bustling private transport sector, for example. You have privately run restaurants, small-scale entrepreneurs that do all kinds of things. I guess what I'm trying to say is these are the main activities that sustain the North Korean economy, but any attempt to put numbers on this is just, it's a proportional guess at best.
Who are the main partners of North Korea, like from the perspective of investments?
You mean foreign partners, or?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, first of all, there is very little foreign investment. I mean, it was before the sanctions, it was growing, and North Korea wants to attract more foreign investment. But it's like if you look at the figures, I think that North Korea's total trade in 2016, which is the year I like to look at because it's before the fire and fury and the heavy sanctions that North Korea is under right now. I believe total value of exports and imports was like something like $3 billion, which, I mean, as I'm sure you know, is very, very little for any country in the world. Well, with that said, around 90% of it around 90% of North Korea's trade is with China. So China completely dominates the North Korean economy among foreign actors. There are even Chinese business people that own or lease some mines in North Korea, and they're leasing a port as well. I believe they're still in control of one of the ports. And in normal times, North Korea exports quite significant amounts significant for the small North Korean economy of steel and coal and seafood. And these are precisely the goods that the sanctions have targeted. And I just want to dwell on this for a second, if I may, because I think that this is, when we look at North Korea's problems, yes, you have the sanctions, you have the enmity with the United States, you have a dysfunctional economy. But I think that something that's underestimated, and something I think the North Korean leadership worries about quite a bit, is the dominance of China in the economy. Because when you have one partner that you're so dependent on, like you're really, China can really make or break North Korea financially, and that's a big long-term problem and short-term problem for that matter.
And my understanding is China doesn't need North Korea. Even that little business they have with them, it's more like probably just for political reasons. Am I wrong?
I don't know. It's so I think on the one hand, no, you're probably not wrong, and especially if you look at North Korea's trade balance, like they have a huge trade deficit. Somehow this is financed, and part of it is probably simply China exporting stuff to North Korea and not expecting any payment, or at least not expecting payment right now. At the same time, I would say regionally, parts of China do need North Korea. Like I visited the border area a few times in China, and like the economy on that side too, not just in North Korea but in China as well, is it's very significantly connected to North Korea. So you have a lot of businesses that do import and export, just like a lot of and some raw materials for certain industries on the Chinese side. I don't know what the situation is right now, but at least at times they've been quite significantly dependent on North Korean imports. And part of the reason for this is that because North Korea basically doesn't have any other significant trading partners, China is in a sense a monopoly importer of a lot of North Korean goods. So usually China has charged or China's paid far less for imports from North Korea than world market value. So yes, like it is it is partially this economic activity comes from a sense of wanting to prop up North Korea and wanting to make sure the regime survives. But at the same time, they're not a very nice ally. Like they are doing North Korea favors, but at the same time they're not. So it's complicated. But yeah, I think it's very fair to say that North Korea needs China far more than China needs North Korea. In the economic sense, grand strategy is a different matter, but there too, I'd say the same thing is true.
Like everything related to North Korea is quite complicated, right? Every time I hear about North Korea, it's primarily because of the nuclear tests or some other stuff. Like, can you explain to me the significance of this nuclear weapon for North Korea? Why do they stuck to it so much, and why don't they want to, I don't know, open up the economy and move on from that?
Well, I think in a sense, Kim Jong-un personally might want to open up the economy, whatever that means in practice. But the nuclear weapons, it's very, very clear that the nuclear weapons and sort of the military deterrent has become the most important thing for the North Korean government. I mean, the most basic reason is survival, really. Regime survival is, if you have to pick out one top goal for the government, it is to survive. And this has been the case this policy of sort of military self-reliance is very old. It has its roots in really the earliest days of North Korea, and it was a very important goal for Kim Il-sung as well, to not be too reliant on China, not be too reliant on the Soviet Union, but to be independent. You can explain this with historical factors. Korea's been invaded, multiple times through its history. I'm a little hesitant. Like, I don't think that you can reduce. It's not so simple as to say that there's a sort of national consciousness of stemming from these invasions. And I mean, I don't know that any country is so deeply steeped in its history when it comes to daily policy, but at the same time, it's not insignificant. And I mean, if you think about it, what else is no matter what our opinions might be of it, if you look at it from the point of view of the North Korean regime, what else can they really do? Like, it's a nuclear deterrent is a relatively cost-effective way of keeping enemies at bay. And they saw what happened with people like Muammar Gaddafi, who struck a deal with the West, and then a few years later he was toppled by its own people, but with the help of foreign powers. And so I'm not sure that, I mean, from their point of view, from the North Korean point of view, the nuclear deterrent is a fairly reasonable priority.
I believe now, and maybe even in the past, there was a rhetoric among the North Korean leaders that tried to develop economy and keep this nuclear weapon like in a parallel.
Exactly.
How is that working, and is it working at all?
Well, so what you're referring to is called the Pyongyang policy. It's the short name for it. And I mean, no, it's not working. I would say it was for a few years, at least. Before, again, North Korea, the sanctions that North Korea is under right now are very, very heavy. And even a lot of their exports to China that are very, very important have dropped significantly. And although some of it is still happening under the radar, but no, the policy was basically not to say that we're not going to choose between, we're not going to say either nuclear weapons or economic development. We're going to do both things at the same time. And for a while, this worked when you had China importing goods from North Korea at the same time as North Korea put a lot of resources into developing this nuclear deterrence. And then I believe it was in April of 2017 that North Korea announced that that they done some final tests. They done a final test of the nuclear deterrent, and they said that now we can focus on the economy because we're done with this. We have the nuclear weapon. So yeah, so I mean, in a sense, it did work for some time, and now the economy is stalling, and it's in a very problematic position. But North Korea has, the regime has survived a lot of unlikely challenges through the years. Like North Korea went through a massive famine in the 1990s that killed, I mean, as many as, we don't know the exact figure, but perhaps around 1 million people after the Soviet Union collapsed and the support from the Soviet Union stopped. So, you know, I try to, if you look only at how things look today for North Korea, it can look very, very grim and it can look very unsustainable. But at the same time, I try to remind myself when in working on North Korea, that things that might seem unlikely in the moment have actually happened. North Korea survived some very unlikely challenges. So all of this is to say that this policy of parallel development, it might sound insane, because how can you develop the economy while the nuclear weapons are creating such an international, makes North Korea's situation internationally so impossible. But they might come out on the other side with having achieved both goals in the long run. Who knows? It's very hard to be certain about it.
It's interesting. I actually was reading when I was preparing for this discussion, I've read that North Korea was actually ahead of South Korea back in the 80s, and then it kind of flipped because of, I guess, Soviet Union and all this stuff.
Yeah, so that's a lot of research says this, that North Korea was wealthier than South Korea until, I believe, 1976 is the year that a lot of people cite. I also think that, I don't know if have you come across this, like there have been evaluations done of CIA estimates of the Soviet economy, and it turns out they were overly positive about it. Like they overestimated the strength of the Soviet economy for decades. And I wonder if that same thing happened with the North Korean economy during this time, because when you read accounts of life in North Korea in the 60s, and that's my own dissertation for my PhD, I focus on more on the 60s and 70s than anything else, really. Like the people like the one thing people have told me is they had enough to eat, but we're not talking about anything more than like survival and then a little bit. So, but yes, you're right. I mean, South Korea was an extremely poor country for several decades of its existence, while North Korea, they put a lot of efforts into building infrastructure, schools, hospitals, like welfare systems, which, and they did so relatively successfully. So that's really one of the main tragedies of North Korea is like there are a lot of countries in the world, unfortunately and very sadly, that are poor and underdeveloped and have massive economic trouble. The thing is with North Korea, you've seen a development where it just went south very quickly from it is an industrialized country. Like it could be quite wealthy and well functioning under different circumstances and with different policy choices. So yeah.
You mentioned that you were researching the life of people, and
yeah,
I'm wondering if you can maybe give us some peek on what's the average family like. Like, what's their life like? And maybe we should start
sure.
with what's average family is in North Korea.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point to start at, because I don't think you can overemphasize the difference in overall material quality of life between the capital city and the rest of the country. It's like different worlds almost. Like a lot of the TV imagery that we see of North Korea comes from the capital, and North Korean government runs. They even have a YouTube channel. I don't know if YouTube shut it down now, sadly, but yeah, like Pyongyang is it's a city with a relatively high living standard. But then, I mean, parts of the countryside are, lack running water and sanitation, basically. So these differences are vast. But if you want to talk about like an average, I'm trying to think about this, because I think probably one region you can look at is like the Northeast, this mining region. Let's say an industrial city like Hamhung, if any of the viewers or listeners are interested in looking further into it. It's a fascinating city. So you have, let's say you have say you have a family father who goes to work in a mine or in a mining related workplace related to the mines. Right now, he wouldn't be doing a lot of work because the demand is lagging for North Korean mining products. So, he would maybe sit around, or he would pay off his manager to be able to go and work somewhere where he can make actual money. That's also something that a lot of people do. At every North Korean workplace, you have mandatory political study sessions. You also have them on Saturdays, which essentially means you only get one day off per week, because at least for half of the day, both parents have to be at least, like they call it, political Saturday. So the person who is really making the money for this imaginary family, that I think is somewhat representative of a certain segment, is the mother in the family, who's working and trading at the market. And this is a phenomenon that started to become very, very common after the famine in the early 2000s and late 1990s. So she'll make something maybe at home. I don't know what it could be, something edible, like cakes or something, and then go sell them at the marketplace. Hopefully her business has grown more and more productive and can bring in more and more money over time. And she, in this sense, is really the one providing for the family, because the father's wages can sometimes be, very low, but practically meaningless, depending on who you work for, of course. I should also say that fewer and fewer people work for actual, like, these state-owned big manufacturing plants that aren't really making anything of value, because the private side of the economy has grown so much. So you'll have private partners that, they'll partner with a state enterprise to get the legitimacy and the ability to run a business, and then they'll still run it in a sort of private fashion with profit seeking. But anyway, this is so back to our hypothetical family. The kids go to school, of course, and after school, depending on the season, they might have requirements to do so-called voluntary work, such as helping in the harvest or planting. They'll also have these mandatory political meetings in the week with the Kim Il-sung Youth League I believe Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il Youth League now, that all children have to be members of. So there are two, and then so there are a few things that I want to clarify, because yes, like we can talk about this, like this is a very generic picture of life in a totalitarian, very politicized society. But one thing that's really struck me, and something I think is important to highlight, is when you talk to people from North Korea, quickly realize that in North Korea, people have everyday lives too, in the same sense that we do. Like, you'll meet your friends after school and go play or study or complain about homework, or, like, I don't know, tease each other or whatever. Like, people do ordinary stuff in North Korea too, or, adults will meet their friends and have a drink at home or something. And then things like that are also very much part of everyday life in North Korea. And stop me if I'm going for too long, but there are two things 2 points I want to make about this too. So one, there are two things that make everyday life, I would say, particularly difficult in a society like North Korea, outside of the everyday struggle of just making money. And that's, these mandatory political meetings that in fact take up quite a bit of time. And although reportedly people care less and less about these meetings because the state is not as important for providing for people as it used to be. But at the same time, this is sometimes several hours that you could spend relaxing, that you have to go to these meetings and just sit off the time, I guess. And so people have, relatively speaking, fairly little free time, which this is part of the design of the system, for sure, to keep people in the arms of the government for as much as possible of the day. The other thing, and this is the one thing that when I've interviewed North Korean defectors in South Korea, I would say the one thing that really stands out as a major difficulty in everyday life is the so-called voluntary labor. Like, you basically having to, after your regular workday, having to go to, might be a construction site, or go out in the field and help with the planting and harvesting for several hours of every day of the week, for entire seasons sometimes. And right now, I don't know if you've come across this news about the so-called 80-day struggle in North Korea.
Yep.
Like, this 80-day struggle for economic construction leading up to the party congress in January 2021. So this is exactly what's happening. That people are, you get told one day by, I don't know, the person at your office who is in charge of reading the newspaper to people, because that's what they do. You have the party secretary of the workplace reading out the most important political news. And he'll tell you, like, oh, we have a glorious task happening. We're going to participate in the 80-day struggle for the honor of the party. And I mean, shit, it's just awful. Like, then you have to, it's backbreaking, tiring, very, very hard. And this is part of everyday life in North Korea. And I think this is something that, I mean, for a lot of people in North Korea, it's just, what are you going to do? This is how it works. But at the same time, it's very difficult.
But do you think it's difficult for you and me who saw that this is not norm in developed countries, and maybe it's somewhat okay for people who live there, who grew up in this regime, or people truly trying to get rid of this, trying to escape?
No, I think it is quite, I mean, just like you said, I think it seems unnormal to us because we didn't grow up in it. I think it seems perfectly normal to most people who live in it. I don't think that means it's any less difficult. Like, especially the idea of voluntary labor, I think it's something that a lot of people have a very suffer a lot from. But yeah, I think you're right. Like, if this is life, then yeah, absolutely. I think it seems perfectly natural and normal, and even imagining life without it might be the hard part.
Yeah. So every country has its elites, right? So how do people become elites in North Korea?
Family background is the most important factor for that. The elite of North Korea today is, so if we're talking about the political elite, like the sort of state-sanctioned, actually, I'm going to go on another, it's not a tangent, because North Korea has a more or less formal hierarchy of dividing, like, where people are divided into different classes of political loyalty based on their family background. It's called the Songbun system. And it's a very important determinant for social opportunity in North Korea. So basically, depending on the background of either your parents or your grandparents, everyone is classified into a certain category of political loyalty. So at the very top, you have the descendants of the guerrilla fighters that fought with Kim Il-sung against the Japanese occupation. They're the core group of elites. And then their children and their grandchildren, they've gone on to the best colleges, universities, and they can get the best jobs within the government. And I mean, the thing is, even elites in North Korea, like not all elites are that wealthy. A lot of them still have to hustle on the side to make ends meet. But yeah, like these are the people with the greatest range of social opportunity. And at the very, yeah, so you asked about elites. I'm going to focus on that. And I mean, you also have several classes of elites. Like if you're talking like the very, very top, I don't know how many people we're talking about, but like the Kim family and a few other families. I mean, they live in absolute luxury. It's very much comparable to the elites of other countries, like the top elites, who they have access to a great deal of wealth, nice cars, whatever it might be, can send their kids abroad to study in countries with the better academic environments. And yeah, I mean, they're often I've heard, and this is very purely anecdotal, but that they're very contemptuous of the people in the bottom, sort of, and I'll tell you one anecdote that I heard from someone, and again, stop me if I'm going for too long, but there's an elite university in Pyongyang that was built by a Korean American, actually, who sponsored this, Pyongyang University of Science and Technology. And I don't know if there's one former teacher there who wrote a book about her experiences. It might have been from her book, I'm not sure. But anyway, like there's this thing that really stuck with me is somebody retelling how these elite students there, with just the amount of how much they despised the soldiers who guarded this compound, because like they were from the country. They were like country bumpkins from North Hamgyong province or something. Like they were just like nothing to them. So yeah, like you have the same dynamic with elites looking down upon the common people in a lot of other countries too. And a lot of these same things exist in North Korea.
So all these elites, like from understanding humans, everybody has ambitions. So why do they care about Kim Jong-un and their dynasty? Why don't they just cope or do something to get rid of them and overtake the government?
Well, they owe their whole position to Kim Jong-un and to their ties with the ruling family and to the system. I mean, the thing is, okay, so when we talk about reform in North Korea, or like opening up or things like that, I mean, the elites of North Korea are not necessarily people who would do very well in other countries. Like they do well in the context that they're in because it's based on their family ties to a great extent.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But I mean, put them in South Korea. Like, what are they going to do there? Like, how are they going to? They don't have this necessary skills to succeed in any other place. And you could probably say the same thing for, let's say, like a Gulf state playboy who just lives off of his dad's oil money. Like, if you drop him without any inheritance in, I don't know, Belgium, like, how's he gonna make a living there? So they have a massive vested interest in keeping the system going. And this is sort of goes back to what I said about like Kim Jong-un has to keep some people happy. These are people who support him because he supports them. It's the classic sort of what's it called? Like client patron system of you scratch my back and like, well, or you remain loyal to me and don't foment any, don't try to chip away at my power and influence because I'll crush you. I mean, essentially he does, it's a very ruthless dictatorship. So the idea that even like that the elites would bond together and move against Kim Jong-un is very difficult to imagine. But I mean, if they are sufficiently unhappy, then they have no reason left. If their wealth would be cut off, like if their positions would come to mean less and less because North Korea runs out of funds, I think it's very unlikely that would happen. But yeah, it's a risk for sure. So Kim Jong-un does have to do certain things to make these people happy, keep them supplied with the things, the living standard and level of comfort that they're used to.
Let's talk about him for a second. Like so my understanding is he studied abroad, right? And he might be a little different from his father and grandfather. Can you paint the profile of the man?
I can try my best.
Sure.
Um, so again, because I do most of my work on sort of everyday life and grassroots level. I know it might sound a little pretentious to emphasize that, but I know far less about the personalities and sort of habits of Kim Jong-un than I do about other facets of North Korea. But I mean, this whole we know very little about him as a person. Yes, it's true that he's educated in Switzerland, and he is relatively young. I believe he's 36 or 37. But other than that, like a lot of people hoped that the fact that he's young and the fact that he lived in Switzerland for a long time, like that would have a huge influence on his policy making. But I don't think we've really seen any signs of that. Like, it doesn't seem to matter so much. He hasn't been the kind of political reformer or economic reformer that people hoped for. Right? By people, I mean people in the West and in China too, probably, and in South Korea. But if I were to paint a profile of him, I would actually look at the policies that he's enacted and what he's actually done through his years in power. And there are a few things that really stand out. He seems to have come to power with a sense and a belief that North Korea needs stronger and better governance. Like, he's consolidated a lot of what North Korea is. Like, look at the market economy. He hasn't enacted any large-scale market reforms, but at the same time, he's made sure that the market economy stays afloat. Like, he's respected I think he sees market economy as a very positive thing for North Korea, while Kim Jong-il, his father, he would periodically try to shut down the country's marketplaces, which is lunacy, but that's what he did. It wasn't lunacy necessarily. It had its rational logic, but still. And Kim Jong-un knows that the market economy is very much there to stay, and he wants it to grow and he wants it to function, but he wants it to be regulated. He wants it to be a regular part of the North Korean economy, and he wants it to bring in revenue to the government. And he also wants to control certain facets of it and to be able to direct and guide the economy without necessarily bringing back central planning. So he is, I believe he's totally okay with the idea of a market-based economic system, but he is very careful to make sure that it doesn't chip away at state control, essentially. Another thing is he's secured or increased border controls a great deal. And I think this is another facet of wanting to consolidate state control and improve governance to, control the borders and stop this flow of defectors and of people illegally crossing for to import and export things. Like, he's okay with trade, but he wants it to happen under more or less formal procedures. He's also emphasized there's been a lot of crackdowns against the flow of outside information under Kim Jong-un. So that's another thing. And again, he's the consolidation of the nuclear deterrent that we've talked about. North Korea was already well along this trajectory when he came to power, but he's really accelerated the development of North Korea's weapons, and he's done very well in it. He's so in that way, he's been, I think his aspiration and his goal is to make North Korea into a well-functioning totalitarian state with nuclear weapons. And if you look at his, the goals that he and North Korea had when he came to power of securing developing the nuclear program and the economy that we talked about before, he's done quite well. Anyway, at least he did for some years. But I'd say overall, he's not, given his own goals and the goals of the regime, he hasn't done poorly at all.
So you said that he would probably want to keep it totalitarian. Do you think that's the only way for North Korea, or there are some other possibilities to, I don't know, pursue?
It's definitely not the only way. No country is ever, there's nothing predetermined about any of this. Every single day that North Korea remains a totalitarian state is a political choice in a way. At the same time, given the balance of, you have elites that you have to keep happy, and they're very dependent on the system surviving. Given that, it's very hard for me to see North Korea turning into a sort of liberal democracy realistically within the foreseeable future. I do think it's possible for it to go down the road of, there are countries in the world that have very harsh systems of oppression and state control, but at the same time aren't necessarily poor. I mean, China is one example of this.
Yeah.
I'd even say, I mean, Singapore is quite different, but it's also an example of really like iron fist rule with a blossoming economy. I mean, you can have both things. And so I don't think that that's an unrealistic goal necessarily.
So let me ask you then, let me follow up on this question then. So knowing that some status quo has to be preserved, but at the same time something can be improved. So tomorrow, Kim Jong-un calls you, says like, okay, Ben, I'm going to listen to everything you're going to tell me, and I'm going to implement it. Tell me what I should what I should do.
I'm counting on and expecting this phone call any day now. So if I may take that question and put it in a scenario where, let's say, okay, North Korea and the United States have made a beautiful peace deal. North Korea is allowed to keep some level of its nuclear weapons program, but dismantle some parts of it. If Kim Jong-un calls me in that kind of situation, then I would say that there are a few long-term important goals to pursue. The first thing I would say, and I think this is very much on his mind already, is North Korea has to decrease its reliance on China. It's absolutely vital for you cannot have an independent functioning state that's dependent on one trading partner to such a high extent, because it also bleeds into political influence independence.
Who do you think they can bring in?
They can diversify if they were to open up their economic system and reform the economy, and in a way that lets them participate in international trade. There are quite a few countries they could trade with. I mean, South Korea is the most obvious answer. Japan as well. I mean, in this imaginary future scenario when North Korea doesn't pose a threat to the international community, yeah, there's no reason they should only trade with China. I really don't see why. There's a lot of fairly wealthy Southeast Asian countries nearby that. But yeah, South Korea and the United States is that. I'm not sure, but yeah, but definitely, I mean, South Korea and Japan are two examples that come to mind.
Yeah, got it. Sorry, I interrupted you. So
yeah, no, it's totally fine. So you're barely interrupting me at all this whole time. So the first thing is North Korea decreases its reliance on China. I think that this is one of the most important goals. The second thing would be, like, I wouldn't say move towards a fully capitalist market economy tomorrow. There's some concrete things that I would advocate. One is privatizing farming to a certain extent, like letting farmers fully control their own production and their own selling and their own planning of what they want to grow, things like that. Let them own their own land to use it as to be able to get loans and things like that. And the other thing relatedly would be creating a system of some sort of private ownership and private property protected by the judiciary. You have to have this for any type of sustainable growth. And North Korea doesn't today. And the other thing I would also say, build a lot of infrastructure for transport. It's very dilapidated in North Korea today. And that's also, or have foreign investors do it, or it's one of these things that I think is overlooked sometimes when like that's also a prerequisite for economic development in the long run. The last thing I would say is that I'm only saying this as trying to look at it from Kim Jong-un's own point of view. If you're a dictator with stability as your main goal, I would say continue to expand the electronic methods of surveillance. This is already something that's been happening in North Korea for a while, and move towards more surveillance cameras, things like that. There's been a lot more, there are legal cell phones in North Korea, legal smartphones that I think upwards of a couple of million people or so have access to smartphones today. But the ones that the North Korean government issues they have surveillance equipment built into the systems. I think this is a very smart move. The more people you have using cell phones like this, the better of an insight into their communication you'll have. So I would say continue to expand. And again, this is not something that I personally want to see happen. I believe in freedom of speech and freedom of thought. I think these are extremely important things. from the point of view of Kim Jong-un, though, I think that if you want to keep the current system stable, this is a very, very smart thing to do. I mean, look at China. It's absolutely mind-blowing, the level of electronic surveillance that a country can achieve. And I suspect that North Korea is moving in that direction too.
One last question I wanted to ask you. Was there anything that I should have asked or I could have asked for you to cover, what you think it's kind of important for people to know, or something very interesting about the country that people would benefit from knowing?
I think one thing is maybe the public sentiment about the nuclear program, actually, because I think this is sometimes overlooked. Like, it's assumed that because it's a repressive regime, it's sometimes assumed that it would lack public support. But I don't think this is necessarily true. I think it might be true on the local level. I don't think a lot of people are very happy about their local party cadres and things like that. But if you look at it on sort of the grand scheme of things, I don't think that, like, we don't know, of course, but I wouldn't rule out that a significant proportion of the North Korean population supports the nuclear program, just because it's such a thing of, for the regime, it's such a thing of national pride. And I think also for a lot of people, like, look what we can do. We're a small, relatively poor country, and we're standing up to the United States. So this whole looking at North Korea as a sort of just black and white, like, regime versus the people. And I hope I didn't talk too much about it today, because I mean, I studied political surveillance, so it's sort of natural for me to get into that kind of dichotomy, but I really don't think it's so simple. And the truth is, we really don't know all that much about public sentiment about the regime in North Korea. But I think that among, at least, again, before the current harsh sanctions and before things turn very difficult in the North Korean economy, I would not have been surprised if it were the case that a majority of the North Korean population had a favorable view of Kim Jong-un, because under his rule, the economy has just been functioning so much better. And as long as things are getting better and not worse, I think that's the most important thing for any political leader of the sort that Kim Jong-un is, that, you know, if things might not be great, but as long as they're getting better, people are happy. It's probably true for democratic countries as well.
Ben, thank you very much for the interview. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you. This is really fun. I really appreciate getting to talk to you about this, and your questions are really, really interesting.